Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly congressional chats. Really, the last 2 weeks, because we missed last week, have been dominated by what's called the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And that's an agreement between House Republicans and the President of the United States on what's called the debt ceiling. The United States limits how much it can borrow. But if the debt ceiling is ever breached, we either have to extend it or, frankly, we're not in a position to pay all of our bills. Nobody thinks that the United States shouldn't pay its bills. That's everything from Social Security checks to crop payments to interest on the debt. Those are things we have an obligation, let alone when it comes to paying our men and women in uniform and providing for the defense. But if you hit your debt limit, then that tells you you're spending more than you should because you've been borrowing money to reach it. And so it's just like when you have a credit card, when you hit the limit, you pay what you owe, but you begin to change maybe the manner in which you're spending. And that's what the big fight was all about. In exchange for raising the debt limit, Republicans said, we think we need to pay our bills, but we need to do some things differently on spending. And this wasn't a perfect deal, but it made some progress in the right direction. First of all, for the first time in a long time, the United States will actually spend less next year than it spent this year. So it's a real fall. We reclaimed money that had not been spent on COVID relief, but had been appropriated. We rolled back for a year the amount of money that had been added to the IRS. That's a fight we'll have to have again, but it was a major concession. We limited, we said we would raise defense and veteran spending and money for the border, but everything else would take a haircut, and again, we would come in lower than it was last year. Republicans succeeded in that. If you'll recall, at the beginning, the president said that we're not going to even negotiate. You have to raise this debt ceiling automatically. Republicans said we will raise the debt ceiling, and indeed Republicans passed legislation to do that, but they put a lot of spending reforms there. Sadly, that bill, which was a good bill, couldn't make it through the Democratic Senate and wouldn't be signed by a Democratic president, President Biden in this case. But it brought them to the table, and the two sides negotiated, and eventually the debt ceiling was raised through January of 2025. And in addition to that, these spending cuts and restraints were put in place. And over the course of a 10-year period, if the promises are all kept, we'll save about $2.1 trillion. That's a lot of money. Now, it's not enough money. The country's still spending way too much, and so we're going to have to keep working on this year in and year out. But we avoided a default, which would have raised everybody's interest rates, honestly would have ground the government to a halt, and probably would have crashed the economy. And instead, we lowered spending, put some caps on spending going forward, and hope to have additional negotiations with Democrats in the months and years ahead. Well, that's good news. This week in the House, you will have heard a little kerfuffle that happened. We had a bill going through, honestly, that had bipartisan support and that every Republican supports. It's called the REINS Act, which would limit the amount of money that an executive order by the president could cost to $100 million. That's the way the president can issue executive orders and spend a lot of money in doing them. We wanted to limit that. We would have liked to lower it to more than 100 million, or less than 100 million, but that's the figure was chosen. We also had some prohibitions. There are some of our regulatory agencies that think you shouldn't be able to have gas stoves or mandating conditions that would make gas stoves a lot more expensive. So we have legislation to take care of that. And it's pretty popular on a bipartisan. A lot of Democrats agree with that. Unfortunately, we had a very small group of Republicans, but it's a small Republican majority that took down not the bill, but what's called the rule. Before you deal with any bill, you have to pass a rule that decides what amendments are in order, how much time is allowed, whether points of orders are appropriate. Oddly enough, nobody that voted against the rule opposed the rule. They actually thought it was fair. And a couple of them had actually voted for the rule in a Rules Committee, which I chair. And nobody is against the bill. This was really, in some ways, a temper tantrum for people that did not like the debt ceiling deal. Look, if you didn't like it, vote against it, and people did, and that's fine. But 2/3 of Republicans and about 70% of Democrats voted in favor of the debt ceiling deal. So, in my view, you don't, just because you're mad and lose a policy vote, you don't then bring down something that's unrelated. But that's what happened this week. Now, I've been in Congress and around legislative bodies long enough to know that usually these things blow over, people work through them, and you keep moving forward. The Speaker and Republican leadership made the decision, we're just going to send people home, let them cool off, hope they come back next week, and then we'll sit down and work through it, because we think the legislation that we were going to consider this week is still worth considering, and we know that every Republican in Congress supports this. I mean, most Republicans think the federal government regulates too many things as it is. This is all about getting back on track, and we will, but it's just sort of the fallout from disappointment by some over the debt ceiling deal. And again, to make the point, that deal wasn't perfect, but it bent spending. We're spending less next year than this year, except in the areas of defense, veterans, and border security. Those are things that most Republicans support, and quite honestly, most Democrats do as well. But again, we're just going to keep working at it. Last point I'll make, actually, this Friday morning, I had the opportunity to sit down with the Speaker, with the Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries. Our Speaker, of course, is Kevin McCarthy. The two top people on the Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro, who's the top Democrat and former chair, a good friend of mine, and Kay Granger, a very good friend of mine, who's the chair of the full committee, Republican, and then a lady by the name of Catherine Clark, who is the Democratic Conference leadership, and myself. And it wasn't a negotiation, it was to talk about how we can move forward on appropriations so we can get all the bills done by the end of the year. And how much are we going to spend, and how is this going to work out? I can't tell you that we concluded any cosmic agreements. We didn't, but we set up a line of communication, and we're going to work these things through. It's a process. It takes weeks and months to finalize appropriations bills. I would expect that to happen this year, but we're going to give a good bipartisan, good faith effort to try and work together and iron out our differences for the good of the American people. Whether we're successful or not, we'll see. And of course, the Senate would have to agree too. They have their own appropriations process, and then we have to sit down with them. And of course, the president still has to sign the bill, or we have to be able to override a veto. And the reality is, Democrats control the United States Senate, so the president's veto would certainly be sustained by his fellow Democrats. But I'm heartened by the fact that we're having this discussion, that I watched the Speaker and the Democratic leader in good faith put their ideas on the table, that I watched Kay Granger, the chairwoman of the full committee, and Rosa DeLauro, our Democratic counterpart, do the same thing. These are people that have worked together surprisingly well over the last several months, and the effort is, even though we have very sharp differences, to keep doing that. And I think that's the way you solve problems in the country. So while, again, everybody was a little disappointed they didn't achieve all their objectives in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that raised the debt ceiling, the majority of members voted for it. Over 314 in favor of it, with substantial majorities on both sides of the aisle. So it's actually an example of Congress working together to find a solution where nobody got everything they wanted, but the American people's interests got looked after and taken care of. So look forward to having a discussion with you next week as this process continues. Hopefully we'll be past this little hiccup where people are upset, and we'll be moving legislation that helps us reform and reduce regulations. But again, I learned a long time ago that self-government it requires you to get up each and every day, work hard at it, take the wins you can get, and then find common ground where you can't, and try to work together and put the American people's interests ahead of your own point of view. That's what we were able to do with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That's what I hope we're able to do in the months ahead with the appropriations process. So have a wonderful week, and look forward to visiting with you next week. Goodbye and God bless.